The HX Collective explores the human experience through three main channels of life: work, relationships, and self. With raw, authentic conversations, the podcast investigates how challenges can become powerful teachers, leading to personal growth and deeper connections. Rooted in humanity-centered design, each episode reflects a commitment to doing good and doing well, featuring diverse voices and generational perspectives. Expect gripping stories of struggle and success, with thought-provoking discussions and concrete tools and tactics that encourage you to rethink your relationship with distress, helping you to establish your full human experience. This is the HX Collective channel. Hello, friends, and welcome to the next episode of the HX Collective podcast. I am so glad you are with us today because you are about to meet one of the coolest people I have met in the last decade of my life. When I talk about women who are up to stuff, you are in for such a treat today as you meet my friend Joanna Meyer, who is the founder and executive director for Women, Work, and Calling at the Denver Institute. She's an exceptional book author. She is a luminary and a leader and a fantastic friend. And you won't want to miss her insights today as we talk about the intersection of work and how faith informs all work, how this leads to a sense of leadership, and ultimately, and one of my most favorite things, calling. What does it look like to have a calling as a leader? So with that, Joanna, thank you so much for saying yes and being with us today on the podcast. Before we dig into our conversation, I'm hoping you can share a little bit more for our audience's benefit about your background and the point of view that brings you to this conversation of work and faith, leadership, and calling.
Mm-hmm. What a gift to be with you, Deb. I can't believe it. It's so fun. A mutual friend of ours, Lisa Slayton, who was also a guest on your podcast, introduced us many years ago. And it's just such a gift to get to collaborate with you. And I consider you a fellow friend and woman who is up to stuff in the world. So this is a great conversation. So I have worked for the last 12 years for a faith-based nonprofit here in the Denver metro area called the Denver Institute for Faith and Work. And this is the fruit of what I often refer to as a patchwork quilt of a professional career. I started my journey professionally right out of college working with university students. I was part of an international organization that had a very values-based approach to helping students navigate both their college years and having imagination for what life after that would look like. So I was all over the world. I was at the University of Nebraska for a number of years. I worked in Spain and Latin America and coached teams around the world. So that was a really fun experience. And then I jumped into the corporate sector for about 4 years and worked in global telecom. And when the economy crashed, the projects I was working on crashed too. You don't invest a lot of money in organizational development when the economy is tight. So I spent many years freelancing, doing nonprofit consulting, doing some copywriting and leadership development. I have skills as a writer and thinker about how people grow. And then over time, I started thinking about the intersection of faith and work. I happen to be a person with a strong spiritual background and was very curious about how the values that people hold inform the work that they do. And so I started studying that in graduate school and teaching about it locally here in Denver, just as the Denver Institute was getting formed. And so our founder saw me and hired me to just run our events, very much like name tags and catering in the early days. He hired me and said, I'm going to hire you now because I have a lot of projects I need you to work on later. And so I've been helping grow this organization for the last 12 years.
First of all, what a great journey. And I love the intersections of experiences. And what I think is cool today, and I hope our audience is going to pick up on this, is that you've had the opportunity to be in a lot of different environments with different kinds of stakeholders. I am confident working with students, there's a certain level of authenticity and genuineness to be influential to bring along the young minds and our next generation leaders. It's also really interesting to me how your work not only has been in the corporate sector around organizational development, but then how that comes into the nonprofit space. So I am certain that folks that are listening will have the ability to hear your wisdom through multiple lenses, whether they themselves are in the same spaces in which you've operated, or they have loved ones who are growing and engaging in that next sense where work and life and all the things come together, rooted in this connection around calling. I'm curious to know that this word calling and just the idea of the meaningfulness in work. We've been in a dialogue as a culture for a while where people are starting to ask, is this all there is? Is beyond work, is there something else? And I'm curious to know if there was any defining moment for you when you had this epiphany that work is so much more than a paycheck. Or let me say this, work could be so much more than a paycheck and really could be about the elevation of purpose and human flourishing.
Yeah. I saw it firsthand when I was working in the corporate sector. So, I started my career working for a nonprofit, and often for listeners that may have had nonprofit experience, those can be very mission driven organizations. They matter because of the cause or the need that you're meeting. And so it was a learning curve for me to step into the corporate sector. And it was a global telecom company. I remember many months my team got assigned to an SAP implementation project. So we were spending long weeks figuring out how do we configure the software for the life of the organization. So, if you really stretch it, you could see the good purpose. And I believe there was a lot of purpose in that work that we were doing. But on the surface, in those long meetings about thinking about software, I wondered, is this really worth it? Compared to the life change I could see when I was working with college students, does it really matter? But I had the privilege in those years of working with some very values-based leaders. They were purposeful in how they conducted themselves as individuals, and also how they thought about the structures and culture we were helping shape at the company. And I just saw firsthand how impactful a principled leader can be in spaces like that. And so for me, that's when the wheels started turning of saying, maybe there's a breadth to influence that I had never considered before, that isn't limited only to the type of work that feels like it's driven by a cause, but actually can be quietly woven into any organization where a person is working or leading. To me, that's the heart of leadership, is how you serve and shape people. So that was the wake-up call for me.
I first saw you when you talk about this. I have been in this space of enterprise software implementations,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be tedious, and yet it is about the humans that are surrounding you in whatever the nature of the work is that can be the difference maker. And you've referenced this idea of being values based in
Mm-hmm.
leadership. And certainly I've seen it and witnessed it in the way you lead your work in your organization. Talk a bit more about the sense of what it means to be values based, because I do recognize that sometimes we can come through exercises and we can pick all the right words that sound like a bit of a mission statement you might see posted on a wall inside of a fast serve restaurant. Say a bit more when we're talking about values based. What does that really look like in the space of serving people
Yeah.
and helping people flourish?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it has echoes to what we'll talk about in our conversation about calling. To feel like you have calling is to respond to a voice that calls. And in my case, because I happen to be a Christian, I have a clear sense of a creator who calls and draws me. But I think if someone doesn't hold the same spiritual convictions, what can be drawing and calling you is those values that you feel are foundational to how you want to live. And I think everyone needs that, whether it's framed by a formal organized religion or not. We all have spoken or unspoken values that define who we are. And so I think values-based leadership starts with getting clarity about what are the fundamental things that will define how you move in the world and how you value people, what your relationship will be to others as individuals, but others also means our broader community, the systems and structures and culture that makes the world work. And so when you begin to define what those will be for you, then call is the response to what those things are, and it will empower your leadership.
I'm so glad that you are helping create that distinction, because sometimes, even in my own mind, when I use the words purpose or values or calling, sometimes it's easy to get those things intertwined. And the reality is, they really are quite distinct if we understand how to access them as leaders. So, when I think about work in and of itself, and when I think about what it might be like for someone to work in an organization for a leader who, as you said, is very clear about their values. And in response to that, calling emerges. Say a bit about just this cultural phenomenon and what's happening, because
Mhm.
I do think so many leaders are in that space where there's just so much distraction. And if you look at a lot of the statistics and how our generations are responding to work, whether it's this idea of jobs are something to be done on a temporary basis, or
Yeah.
there's this movement of like anti-hustle in culture.
Hmm.
When you think about the sense of being values based, what does that look like? And what is to be said to the leader who's trying to respond and be very convicted in serving people when it seems like the larger culture around us is really competing against us or may really test us when it comes to our core values?
Yeah, I think you have to step back and say, what is the foundational purpose of work? And the forces around us, whether it's the values of the MBA program that you graduated from, if some of our listeners are MBAs, or the values of your family that have defined what it means to be a successful person. It can also be shaped by the region of the country that you grew up in. I'm often fascinated as I travel the country as a speaker and organizational leader, how regional the different values are. And I would even say that there are some cultural idols that people, quote unquote, worship. They direct their life and their work around it. So it will look different in Silicon Valley than it does in Boston, Massachusetts. I often think the messages about what purposeful work look like are shaped very much by where you went to school. If you're in the Boston area, in New York City, it might be shaped by the amount of money the hedge fund you're applying for. Or if you're in finance, you're thinking about dollar signs. And Silicon Valley, you're thinking about how you can get funded by your tech startup or whose powerful circles you can get into. If you're in DC, it's going to be how close are you to power and how are you climbing a ladder to get more power. When we think about how we find values in work, we have to step back and say, how can the work itself have value apart from some of the cultural messaging around us that says what success or value looks like? I also think it has to exist outside of, think about how to phrase this. This ties into calling, where we want to see like how it can exist outside the temporary values of this moment. So I think that's one of the challenges in this moment as we see AI emerging and playing a broader role in our working lives. We have to know with razor clarity what it looks like to be human and what the dignity of a human worker looks like to be able to fully and thoughtfully integrate a new technology like AI. So some of those guiding values, like what is a human, or what does flourishing, or what does health, what do we want for every employee? When we have those core ideas defined, we're not shaped by those cultural influences that I list, or we're able to better respond to those dramatic moments of loss, like an economic collapse or emerging technology. But without that foundational framework about work and the value of the worker or the purpose of work, we're going to be lost.
I've been hearing so many commentators and experts talk a lot about this idea of the disruptions that could draw us away from our sense of humanity. And so many are saying this has never been a better time for us to lean into what it means to be fully human and to engage with humans in relationships, because that is the distinction and differentiator that will stand out as our world increasingly becomes more efficient and more driven by some of these disruptions in technology like AI. I'm curious, as a person who is at the epicenter of really bringing forth this sense of work and this ability to lean into human connection and human relationships, what is it about work in this context that excites you when you think about our ability to really play full out and have meaningful work? What would that look like for the human experience from your vantage point?
Yeah. I'm going to let my faith convictions show a little bit. Hopefully, I can express it in a way that will be meaningful for any listener, regardless of what traditions they draw from. But as someone who is deeply rooted in both the Hebrew and Christian scripture, one thing that stands out to me is the foundational purpose of work that you see in the book of Genesis, that people are created in the image of a creator or working God to bear his image in the world. That can seem like very religious language, but just the idea that if you believe that there's a creative force that has shaped the universe, we are made to reflect that in how we go about our daily work. And so you're a different person than I am, Deb. And I think about our listeners maybe, broadly different in the traditions and ways that they have been made. But the idea that who they uniquely are is a reflection of this diverse and loving and powerful creator. So just by being who God made you to be, you are reflecting eternal attributes in the world, which is just amazing. But also that we're created to work. Like the earth has been entrusted to us to develop it, its potential to care for it, to steward the resources that are there. And so that is a timeless principle that translates across industries, across generations and millennia. of figuring out what does faithful stewardship of the resources and potential of individual lives and also the world and cultures that have been entrusted to us. Those are some guiding principles that you could chew on. That's a rich conversation over coffee with people in your life, regardless of what their faith conviction is.
It's a great segue to talk even a little deeper about the intersection of faith and work. And I know we're certainly in a time and culture where the desire to keep things separate and to really think that our faith life and our professional life aren't necessarily shouldn't be interwoven or spoken about. And yet knowing that for when faith is such an important part of your identity and who you are, that there's a real cost when we try to operate independent and not as a whole person. And I guess I would be curious again, how, when you think about the nature of the audiences in which you're working with, and while people do come to Women Work and Calling through the faith lens, often I do know that there is a community of folks that are not coming from a faith persuasion, and yet they encounter something when a person is really authentically trying to live out those values through that faith lens. What more can you say about the power of integration when it comes to your faith and to this sense of work?
Yeah, I think about for organizational leaders, one of the questions you're thinking about is how do we create an organizational culture where employees feel like they can bring their full selves to work? And for a long time, we have had maybe a narrow or compartmentalized vision of what it looks like for a person to authentically live their faith at work. That could be thinking that it results in awkward water cooler conversations that make other employees feel painful or that create pressured conversations. And really, when you think about a person's faith, regardless of what tradition they come from, it, as we've alluded to, draws deeply from their values. It also means they're probably bringing different resilience to the workplace because they're able to rely on a higher power in moments of stress or peace. It typically will have a vision of servant-based leadership and sacrifice. Wouldn't you want that among your employees? I think about middle managers of big corporations. I want people there who have a deep, sacrificial, servant-hearted commitment to shaping the teams that they lead. So I think there's a lot that is said that is positive to be said. I also, if I can point the finger a little bit, I think at this particular moment in American culture, some people of faith are doing a really lousy job of what it looks like to love and serve in their vision of what it looks like to steward power. And so we have a unique moment where people of a certain faith tradition have said, I'm going to pursue power regardless of what the consequences of it are for others. And I don't think that actually is a biblical understanding of what power. If you look at Jesus's leadership, that is not what he pursued in his life and ministry. And so we need to have braver conversations about what an authentic expression of faith looks like across religious traditions. And there's just a powerful movement right now of employee resource groups that are doing a really great job with that, of figuring out how can we bring the strength of faith into the workplace with a deep commitment to the plurality of perspectives that are here. And so I would encourage, if someone's curious about this, to lean into some of the broader conversations that are coming both from faith-based ERGs, and they exist in major corporations. The Fortune 500 is peppered with faith-informed employee research groups. And also, what does it look like to have interfaith conversations through organizations like that? There's a ton of benefit to companies that are willing to lean into that. And sometimes we just need better examples of how we do it.
Yeah. You brought up a word that sometimes doesn't always hit in a work context, but I do often when I speak about leadership and I speak about the journey of what it means to be the type of leader that can create conditions where human beings can flourish. Love is really the acid test. And like you, faith is such a cornerstone of what fuels me and the work that I do. And when I asked, someone said, what is your leadership style? And I said, it's actually love. It's a desire to love people into their most lovely form. And when I think about the intersection of where this concept of leadership and how that starts to cross over into calling, let's talk a bit about how love and leadership will actually bring forth this concept of calling. But before we do this, you started a moment ago to say a little bit about what calling is. And I was suggesting that sometimes we get these things at the intersection points. Say it again. If I'm listening and I'm thinking about values and purpose, and then I'm thinking about this situation, what does it mean to have a calling? How do you define it? And
Yeah.
how is it distinct from maybe an
Mhm.
ambition or a passion?
Yeah. Well, I think there are a ton of misconceptions about what calling is. In fact, I think I make people uncomfortable because I often point to a more general understanding of calling than specific. So, a couple of ways that we get our understanding of calling wrong, and then I'll tell you how I think we can get it right. So, how we get it wrong is that we think calling is a specific destination. So, a person will approach the process of vocational discernment and think, what is my calling? Like it will be a forward pointing direction. And so our job is like to search for call like it's a needle in the haystack. And I think it's very different. If you look at the Latin word that has informed the idea of calling, it's closely tied to a word we might use, vocation. I tend to use calling and vocation synonymously, but vocation in particular comes from the Latin word vox or voice. And so it is a response, in my case, because I'm a person of faith, to God's voice. And it's a whole life response. It begins with an invitation to follow God in everything that I do. If you aren't a person from a faith tradition, I think that response would be the response to your values that invite you into a different way of living. And so when we start with the general idea of what a whole life response to that invitation looks like, it actually frees us up to be powerfully entrepreneurial about developing our own life rather than hunting for that one thing we're supposed to do. We say, how can I holistically live out the big picture of who I am and what I'm supposed to do in everything that has been entrusted to me? I want to give you a quote from one of my favorite authors, Steve Garber. Let me pull it up. I put it in my notes. Steve Garber has written a book called A Vision for Vocation. And this is what he says about vocation, and specifically realize we're using it interchangeably with calling. And so this is what he says. He says, vocation is when we come to know the world in all its joy and pain and still love it. Vocation is following our calling to seek the welfare of the world we live in, and in helping the world to flourish. Strangely, mysteriously, we find that we flourish too. And then he goes on to say, in the context of one's calling, how does one learn to see with the eyes of the heart, to see oneself as responsible for the way the world is and isn't?
Wow. That is so powerful and so intertwined with our mission here at the HX Collective. And when you read that and you take apart the pieces, I'm curious to know what piece stands out most for you. I'm going to share with you in a moment what my first reaction was, but I want to hear what you say first. When you see this picture, what piece really stands out to you?
To me, Steve Garber asks, can you know the world and love it? And that is a powerful place because every single one of us has been entrusted with our unique little corner of the world. And the challenge is to say, what are we going to do with it? As you
Yeah.
think about what your purpose and what your values are in the world, how will you operationalize that in the spaces that you are? And I believe for me, I feel like I have a higher calling that informs anything I do. It's one of the reasons that one of the things that motivates me to be a member of my local homeowners association board, which let me tell you is not a lot of fun. My board members are great. I really like coming alongside them, but the experience of leading my neighborhood homeowners association is a hard one. But for me, it's one of the most practical ways I can love my neighbors because nobody wants to do that job. And when our board isn't well run, our whole community suffers. And so for me, that's like a challenging expression of calling is I have said yes to loving my neighbors. And so I had to ask in my little condominium complex here in Aurora, Colorado, what is the most meaningful way that I, with the skills and resources I have, can practically love my neighbors? So I think that's a big part of calling. And I would encourage our listeners to see it rather than a specific destination that we're trying to determine. It's a through line that we see in our lives. And so sometimes early in our careers, calling isn't always readily apparent, which can be hard because you want to know in those first steps out of college what you're supposed to do. But I think as you begin to see your life unfold, you'll see certain ways of moving in the world or certain skills or attributes that you bring to the type of work you do. And you realize, oh, this is like a thread that is connecting the beads on a string of pearls at each season and stage. Who I am is similar or in these spaces. And I think that's very freeing, is less to focus on what's the individual pearl and just say, how do I better understand what this through line of who I am in these spaces will be?
Yeah, that first of all, your illustration of thinking about this not as that sense of like it's something to work towards and then
Mhm.
land like a destination, but that through line that's informing any place in which we're planted or any with any circumstance or people that we are entrusted. The piece of the quote that you read that really stood out for me was this understanding of calling is also not based on circumstance and resilience to be true. And I remember one of the highlights of my university experience was to have a chance to meet Walter Cronkite. Now I'm
Wow.
dating myself, so if we've got some young folks, he was a very prominent news reporter, but
Yeah, and back when
nonetheless,
there was like only we didn't have streaming, so there were only a few networks. He was the voice of news to America.
he was, and he
Mhm.
said one of the most important things, and I think it brings together what you're describing and how you're speaking about calling and how you're quoting Steve's quote in that this is about being true to who we are and how we are made and who we are to be in all circumstances, whether it feels exciting and stimulating and thrilling. It is that through line. It's the mainstay. And Walter
Mhm.
Cronkite had said the best piece of advice that he had received in his journey was to thine own self be true, to this sense of being really anchored in what I hear you saying in your description of calling. And I don't recall ever hearing you say that in a conversation we've had before about calling and voice. And I just had this epiphany when I'm thinking about how we can and how work is one of the most like valuable spaces to find our voice, which is present with us in all circumstances, and that idea of a through line. So thank you for this and the growth that I'm having even in the midst of our conversation. I'm curious if there's anything else you might say, again, as you're thinking about this idea of calling without regard to the pleasantry of a circumstance, i.e., also known as the homeowners association.
Oh, yeah, totally. I think that actually, when you have a sense of calling, that actually helps you navigate circumstances because you know that your primary identity is not defined by the work that you do. And
Yeah.
that is so hard in modern life. I think about what looks like to show up on LinkedIn consistently. We often talk about having a brand identity and who you are and how you work, that you consistently show up and present this polished image of yourself. And it's easy to look in a space like LinkedIn and think that's a true reflection of who the person is. But all of that can crumble. The economy can turn on a dime. And the industry, I think about friends who have prepared for a career in academia and they had a very specific vision as they were working on their doctorates of the types of jobs that they wanted to have. And as higher education has shifted over the last 10 or 20 years, what they envisioned that work looking like has changed dramatically. And they realized they no longer wanted to be working in higher education. And so if their primary identity had been wrapped up in becoming a college professor, they would have been utterly lost. But my friend had a better understanding of calling that wasn't tied to a specific role and has been able to pivot. And so she has asked questions about what are the types of the roles that will use the education that I've gained over the last 10 years, but also allow me to serve in a way that's better aligned to who I am as a person. And so this broader view of calling rather than a specific destination and more like a faithful journey of stewarding how we are in circumstances, it actually helps us pivot. I ask that about myself sometimes. If something changed and I needed to do something dramatically different, would my identity be secure enough that I could make that change and not have it destroy me?
Well, being a leader in your own right, and as I'm thinking about my role as a leader in my organization, and thinking about people who are listening today who
Mhm.
have the functional role or the job title that includes some
Mhm.
form of leadership, how do you or what do you think about the responsibility we share as leaders? Do we have a responsibility to help our people, the people who've been entrusted to us, find their calling, to
Hmm.
create space for their voice? Is it the responsibility of leaders to do this?
I would say like yes and no. So, yes, in the sense that as a leader, you're stewarding human potential. And so you want to create the kind of place where people are having the potential, having the opportunity to consider how do they best work, designing workplaces that will support whole people and opportunities for them to grow. But I think it's a lot of weight to put on the shoulders of one leader to say, hey, that is the place that a person is going to discover their calling. And so I think having a healthy, broad understanding of calling pointing toward people towards resources that can help them learn and grow. And being a dialogue partner is really vital. And so that's maybe a more helpful framing of it, is to say, hey, people are responsible for their own journeys, but how can you create the kind of environment where people are gaining self-knowledge, where they're working for someone that believes in their potential and will create opportunities for them? And also, how can you become a dialogue partner with the people that you serve? Because I think that's the reality for most leaders, is that you end up being a pass-through for employees onto other stages and seasons of their career. So for the season that a person is with you, how can it be a developmentally rich season on their professional journey?
Thinking about folks who may be listening today that are on that journey, and maybe they're in that space of a pass through, and perhaps they're working in an environment or working for a leader who isn't the dialogue partner. How
Mm-hmm.
can someone flourish even in the midst of that circumstance where maybe the
Yeah.
leader or the environment is not conducive necessarily to finding our voice? How does someone still grow and flourish?
Yeah, that's a really powerful question, because you may not have a leader that does that, or they have a different vision of what the purpose of work and team are. We are in a season in which opportunities for development are richer than they ever have been. I am so impressed by the leadership books that are being released, or opportunities for self-knowledge through assessment tools or podcasts. I think you can get amazing professional development through listening to podcasts, or there's digital MBAs. It may not have the same cachet as getting an MBA from the University of Chicago's business school, but there is a lot that you can do to be developing yourself. And I would say learning how to be an effective networker, not just for your own personal gain, but networking for the purpose of building mutually beneficial relationships and connecting with others. I think there are a lot of ways you can be growing your career by building networks of really supportive relationships. Find some better people to talk to. If your boss isn't going to be that person, there are people out there if you know how to find them.
Well, and I think that's a really practical insight, that we are not defined only in the hierarchy of traditional boss employee, but that we really can have a different take on the various exposures that we may have, and how leadership can show up in a very distributed or non-hierarchical way. It's a really important piece of guidance for folks to look around, see the environment in which you're operating more than just the simple hierarchical frame. One of the reasons I wanted to do this podcast was the desire not only to have really smart and accomplished people like yourself give us a little glimpse or a taste of those wisdom and those insights and the stories and experiences. I really wanted to do this as the place where people can become replenished and nourished. And one of the through lines that I try to engage is always to have some practical wisdom, some practical guidance, particularly giving people specific calls to action, if you will, notwithstanding there are a lot of real world tensions that are surrounding us. And so, if there's someone right now who's listening and feels like they're in a space that it's soul crushing, like that there's a really they're not going to be able to become that best version of themselves in the environment. What is your honest counsel? Do they stay in the name of looking around them? Is it time to leave in the pursuit of being able to bring their voice and calling to life? What is some practical wisdom you would give to the person right now who's at the end of their patience and is in that space where it feels hard and really unbearable?
I think a few variety of things I would say is, what's keeping you there? I think one of the best times to be looking for a new job is when you're currently employed. And so I would say, if it truly is soul crushing, is that really the only option of what you can be doing for work? Or is it time to get very serious about looking for a new job after hours? Get networking, get learning, begin asking questions about what else you can be doing. I think that's important for anybody in this season, as we're seeing AI start to create disruptions in the workforce. We all need to be looking and learning and networking and pursuing new opportunities. So I would say, what's keeping you? And then I also would say, like, how are you allowing other people to be present and an encouragement to you? Get that relational network going. So many jobs are found through soft networks. It may not be your best friend that gives you a job, but a friend of your best friend or a professional contact of your best friend will have that opportunity for you. And so just actively start building relationships with people and sticking your neck out there. Have a clearly defined invitation for coffee saying, I'm wondering if we could talk about X. Can I buy you a cup of coffee? Not just a general invitation of I'm discontented with my job and do you have a job for me? But something very specific you're trying to learn that this person might be able to offer. Define the amount of time that you want them. Do you have 45 minutes for me to buy you a cup of coffee at a location that's convenient for you? Do some things that make it easy for people to say yes and just see where those conversations lead.
Wow. And you're reinforcing such an important point that our flourishing rarely happens in isolation.
Yeah.
And if we are struggling, that relationship engagement is the mechanism from which we can find a better human experience. And I love the practicality of it isn't simply go to more networking events or simply go out for more coffees. It's the purpose of what it is that you're looking to learn or how you're seeking to grow or how you're trying to find that support and encouragement that may then be the catalyst that bridges you to your next work opportunity.
Yeah. Can I offer a thought that is in the other direction too? As you were talking, I was like, I think we need to acknowledge the very real pain and brokenness that comes from work. I think that's one thing that has been helpful for me as a person with a strong spiritual foundation is that I have a really clear-eyed understanding of just how broken the world is. And my guess is for those of us that are listening today, you could make a list of all the things that really are not healthy or not the way they should be about the spaces that you fill. And we need to have an understanding of how we respond to the very broken things we see every day. If you read the newspaper in the morning, you will see that. And so practices like soul care or spiritual care can be very healthy. Or in the Christian tradition, there is a practice of lament where you are able to just emotionally offer the very sorrowful things that you see. And I think our journey of work also it means that we have grief that comes along with it. It's the loss of a dream job or potential that isn't realized and something that you thought could be really good. And so learning how to lament or healthily offer emotion and process it is really important too.
Yeah. Thank you for creating that appropriate balance for the reality of what we may be experiencing right now in our work and in the real pain and the capacity to access that and to validate that lamentation is a valid way of restoring good health and accessing our flourishing. Thank you so much.
Try Googling what does it mean to lament and just see what opportunities are there. Might spark some creativity.
I love it. The next sort of practical piece of wisdom I'm hoping you can share is for the leaders who are listening that may feel a spark and are inspired. How do you counsel leaders? What would you share with them on a really practical basis if they want to be more mindful and more on purpose in creating cultures of flourishing without regard to maybe the difficulty or struggle of the circumstance, but actually really put energy and effort into building cultures where human beings can have that favorable experience?
That's a really good question because it's not unusual for a company to have a mission statement or to have values that you print on the wall. But I would say if you're a leader of people, I'd ask a couple questions. One is of those organizational values, how well are you doing it actually living them out? Like having a very honest conversation with yourself about how you're embodying them. But also ask yourself, are there values that are unique to you as a leader a experiences that you want your employees to have that you maybe haven't put words to. Put your own spin on it. Like a couple questions to ask might be, how do I want people to experience me as a leader? Even as I say this, I'm realizing like, oh, I need to take a step back and ask myself that because I haven't done it in a while. Get beyond just the corporate jargon and ask, how do I want people to experience me as a leader? Or are there kind of fundamental values I want to be true of my work? And then say, how do I operationalize it? That's where a lot of those corporate mission statements fall short, is that we don't take that step to say like, okay, when it comes down to like the nuts and bolts of how we interact every day, how are we going to make this a reality? Like actually live it out. And so begin to think about, like I have a good friend, I think we have a mutual friend, Jasmine Bellamy, who talks about love in corporate settings. Okay, so what does it look like for love to be expressed practically? Like break it down to your operations. Put your HR processes, put your performance reviews, standards, put them through the filter of love and see how would that shape how we actually do it. I think of my friend Utibe Massey, who's a VP at a big public utility in Virginia. And she recently wrote a book called Love as a KPI, where she actually starts pushing people to say, like, okay, it's one thing to talk about this, but like, how do you actually define it and measure it? So like, how do you begin to build some key performance indicators around your values? And I'm not joking, like actually make it real.
Yeah, that's great. Joanna, one of the things that makes you so accessible is that you do the things that you're speaking about. And I can say that confidently. I get to watch how much love and light you're bringing to the world through every circumstance in which you've been entrusted. In what ways are you still growing? And when you think about the intersection of your work and how faith, in the case of you're in a faith-based organization, so perhaps that's a little easier to access. But when you think about leadership, you think about your own calling. How are you still growing?
That's like the $1 million question, Deb. I think something that I have been thinking about, this is going to be a very midlife answer because I'm in midlife. And often in midlife, you get one of those looks where you're kind of like, okay, I've built a life around what I thought it should be. And in some ways it's really worked out, and in some ways it isn't. And so one of the deeper questions that I'm asking is what joy in leadership looks like when you really have been steeped in the realities of the world and you're really getting a bigger look at like disappointments in life. Like I have been amazed by what I have been able to do and want to find joy in that, and how I see communities being shaped through my efforts. And there's some big disappointments too. And so I'm still figuring out like, what does it look like to hold those disappointments in a healthy way? What does it look like for me to have genuinely healthy rhythms of work and rest? Like I'm a visionary leader with a lot of galvanizing energy. A helpful tool for leaders I would recommend is Patrick Lencioni's Working Genius Assessment. Have you ever done that, Deb?
I have
Super
not.
helpful.
Okay.
Oh, it's
Yep,
super helpful. One of the best tools for teams. He's written a long time about organizational culture and leadership in teams, but his new assessment, the Working Genius, is phenomenal. His company is called the Table Group, if anybody's Googling it. But one of the qualities of my own leadership is that I'm a person that galvanizes others, which means that I have a lot of rocket fuel in the tank to share vision and mobilize people. Like I can say, hey, everybody get involved. Here's a worthy task. Everybody on board. And it can also be exhausting. And so I just am having to sit with that in midlife of like, okay, just because you have a lot of rocket fuel that you can burn, what happens when you burned it, most of it, and there's not as much in the tank? So lots of deeper questions going on in my life of what it looks like to be a healthy leader who holds disappointment and joy and fatigue and a heavy ability to work, like how I hold those together. And
Yeah. The other thing that I would be remiss if we got through this conversation and I didn't also acknowledge one of the really courageous things you've done in recent years is take a hand at becoming a book author. Can you share just a minute? Grab your book because again, there it is. So, all right. So women work in calling. First of all, how does one have the courage to actually do this? Because I've had many people have come to me and said, Deb Knupp, it's time. You need to write a book. And I just, the idea of doing this. So tell us a little bit about the book and it particularly recognizing that it does really speak to a woman's experience. Tell us a little bit about it and what we could draw from it if we're feeling this space, particularly at the intersection of work and faith.
We've acknowledged that I happen to be a person of faith. It's been really important to me. And I think the intersection of faith and work has been inspiring for me. It's created a new imagination for work, of just seeing the beauty of doing life with God and service to others, and specifically in how that plays out across industries and stages and communities all around the world. And so as I started stepping into that framework, I realized that there was just this colossal gap for women in the faith communities that I run in. There's amazing work getting done in cultivating women's inner lives and strengthening their relationships, like virtually nothing speaking to women's roles in public life. As we started to do some gender-specific programming at the Denver Institute for Faith and Work, we realized like women were very hungry for a richer conversation that provided a healthy, integrated framework and baptize their ambition as a really healthy thing. And I think it is when it's surrendered to the values that you have and heavily sorted through those values. It's actually a beautiful tool. We have to change the world. So the book came about as I started to realize that we had some core frameworks that have been shaped by what Denver Institute does that could be uniquely tailored to women's experiences. You'll notice it's very thin, and that was intentional. It's 20 short chapters that are heavily discussion oriented so that you could read this with friends, or you could do it as kind of a daily time of spiritual nourishment and journaling. So as I started to get that framework, or saw a need, started to get a framework that I felt could be something that we could explain and teach to others, we had an opportunity with a major publisher to produce Women Work and Calling. And so it's been fun. And it's been a very powerful tool for continuing this conversation around whole life development for women of faith.
I love it. As we wrap for today, thank you so much for bringing to light your journey and helping us have a different take, perhaps, on how we see the world of work and what it means to have this whole person experience, both as leaders or as people who are growing in their vocations. I absolutely love that you've helped me really crystallize that, again, calling and vocation intersecting and finding that with wherever I am, that inspiration to not see it as something to chase or that I'm waiting to happen, but rather having it be ever present right now, right where I am, regardless of circumstance. And I really appreciate the permission to hold some space for some struggle, and that to lament and to acknowledge the disappointments that we may be or have encountered is also really authentic to our human flourishing. And so as we wrap today, any closing thoughts or advice that would be useful for our listeners or that would put a wonderful capstone on our conversation today?
Okay, can I read you a closing quote?
Please do.
This is from the author Alain de Botton in his book, The Pleasures and Sorrows of Work. He wrote it in 2008. He says, "When does a job feel meaningful? Whenever it allows us to generate delight or reduce suffering in others. Though we're often taught to think of ourselves as inherently selfish, the longing to act meaningfully in our work seems just as stubborn a part of our makeup as our appetite for status and money."
On that note, I adore you and I thank you so much. I cannot wait for our next opportunity to be together. And once again, appreciate so much to bring this conversation to life. We'll see you soon. Thanks for being here. If today's conversation sparked something in you, we hope you'll carry it forward with curiosity, compassion, and courage. Subscribe to the show, leave a review, and share this episode with someone who needs it. Until next time, keep exploring what it means to be fully human.